Imagine boarding a train in Cairo, Egypt at 6:30 on a Monday morning. The train accelerates to 220 kilometers per hour. It crosses the Sahara, stops at Khartoum, continues south through Nairobi, pauses at Dodoma in Tanzania, pushes on through Harare in Zimbabwe, and arrives in Cape Town, South Africa in time for breakfast on Wednesday morning. The entire length of the African continent, roughly 12,000 kilometers, covered by a single rail journey in under 48 hours. Now imagine another train departing Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, heading west across the widest part of the continent, through South Sudan, through the Central African Republic, through Cameroon, through Nigeria, and arriving in Dakar, Senegal on the Atlantic coast 8,100 kilometers later. Today, neither of these journeys is possible. There is no continuous railway connecting North Africa to Southern Africa. There is no rail link from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean. In fact, 13 African countries have no rail connection to a seaport at all. 16 African nations are landlocked, their economies strangled by some of the highest transportation costs on Earth. It costs more to ship a container from Mombasa, Kenya, to Kampala, Uganda, a distance of 900 kilometers, than it does to ship that same container from Shanghai, China, to Mombasa, a distance of 8,000 kilometers across the Indian Ocean. Africa has 75,000 kilometers of railway. Most of it was built by European colonial powers over a century ago. Most of it is decaying. Most of it does not connect to anything, and almost none of it is compatible with the railways in neighboring countries. In 2013, the African Union decided to change everything. They endorsed the most ambitious railway project in history, the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network, a plan to connect every capital city and major commercial hub on the continent with a unified, interoperable, high-speed rail network spanning over 50,000 kilometers. The estimated cost is at least $100 billion. The timeline extends to 2063. This is the story of the railway that could transform a continent, if it can actually be built. Chapter 1. The Colonial Skeleton. To understand why Africa needs the AIHSRN, you have to understand the railways that already exist and why they were built the way they were. During the era of European colonialism between roughly the 1860s and the 1960s, colonial powers built approximately 30,000 kilometers of railway across Africa. But these railways were not built to connect African communities to each other. They were built for extraction. Every line followed the same pattern. Start at an inland mine, plantation, or agricultural zone and run in a straight line to the nearest coastal port. The minerals, timber, and crops flowed outward to European markets. Nothing connected east to west, nothing connected north to south. Neighboring colonies, not even those controlled by the same European power, were often deliberately kept unconnected to prevent the development of independent African trade networks. Worse still, the colonial powers used different rail gauges, the width between the rails that determines what trains can run on what tracks. The British used meter gauge in East Africa and Cape gauge in Southern Africa. The French used meter gauge in West Africa. The Portuguese used yet another gauge in Mozambique and Angola. Africa has at least 9 different rail gauges in active use across the continent, making it physically impossible for a train from one country to cross into another in most cases. When African nations gained independence in the 1960s, they inherited railway systems designed to serve foreign interests built to incompatible standards and already beginning to deteriorate. In the decades that followed, most African governments prioritized road transport over rail. Some investment in railways collapsed. Tracks deteriorated. Rolling stock aged and broke down. Skilled railway workers left. By the early 2000s, the African Union estimated that the continent's 75,000 kilometers of existing railways had decayed severely due to poor management, old and dysfunctional equipment, and increased competition with road transport. In Sudan, ongoing conflict reduced the operational railway network from 6,000 kilometers to just 600. The result is a continent of 1.4 billion people, growing faster than any other, with a railway network less extensive and less functional than what existed a century ago. Africa accounts for roughly 17% of the world's population, but only about 2% of global rail freight traffic. Chapter 2. The Vision. In 2013, at the 24th African Union Summit, the heads of state of African nations endorsed Agenda 2063, a continent-wide development plan subtitled The Africa We Want. Among its flagship projects was the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network, the AIHSRN. The vision is staggering in its ambition. The plan calls for a grid of 10 major rail corridors, 6 running east to west from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean or Red Sea, and 4 running north to south from the Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope. These corridors will be built to a unified standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters, the same gauge used by most of Europe, China, and the United States. Trains will run at speeds of at least 200 kilometers per hour, requiring electrified, dedicated high-speed track. The network will connect every capital city on the continent. It will link all 16 landlocked African nations to major seaports and neighboring countries. It will establish interoperability across all regions, meaning a train loaded in Lagos can travel without stopping or transferring cargo all the way to Dar es Salaam, Djibouti, or Cape Town. It will serve as the infrastructure backbone for the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, which came into effect in 2021 and aims to create the largest free trade area in the world by number of participating countries. In 2014, the African Union signed a Memorandum of Understanding with China for the 30 to 50-year development of the continental rail system. The African Union Development Agency, AUDANEPAD, was designated as the implementing body. Detailed scoping studies were commissioned from international engineering firms including CPCS Transcom, Oricon, and ILF Consulting Engineers. The implementation plan was divided into 3 phases: short-term from 2015 to 2025, medium-term from 2025 to 2045, and long-term from 2045 to 2063, the centenary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. The first phase was supposed to complete comprehensive planning, launch pilot corridors, and begin construction on priority links. Pre-feasibility studies were completed for several corridors, including the 2,891-kilometer Cotonou-Niamey-Ouagadougou-Abidjan corridor, estimated at $5 billion, the 2,366-kilometer Djibouti-Libreville corridor at $5.3 billion, and the 5,139-kilometer Dakar and N'Djamena-Djibouti corridor at $14 billion. But studying a railway and building one are very different things. Chapter 3. The Trailblazers. While the Continental Master Plan has moved slowly, individual African nations have forged ahead with their own railway projects, each one becoming a building block or a cautionary tale for the larger network. Ethiopia was the first to deliver. In 2018, the electrified Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway opened, connecting landlocked Ethiopia's capital to the port of Djibouti on the Red Sea, a distance of roughly 750 kilometers. Built by Chinese contractors and financed primarily by Chinese loans, the railway cut travel time from 3 days by road to roughly 12 hours by rail. It was the first modern cross-border railway in Africa and the first electrified standard gauge line on the continent. Ethiopia is now planning extensions towards South Sudan. Kenya followed in 2017 with the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, a 480-kilometer line connecting the Indian Ocean port of Mombasa to the capital Nairobi, built at a cost of $3.8 billion. And with a further $1.5 billion extension to the town of Naivasha completed in 2019. The SGR dramatically improved freight transport from the port and became popular with passengers, but the project is controversial. The Export-Import Bank of China provided $3.2 billion in loans, enormously increasing Kenya's debt. The railway still runs at a financial loss, and critically, the planned extensions to Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan have stalled after China's Exim Bank declined to provide further financing. Tanzania has emerged as perhaps the most impressive success story. The Tanzania Railways Corporation is building a 2,000-kilometer standard gauge network in 6 phases, connecting the port of Dar es Salaam to the interior and eventually to neighboring Burundi, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Phase 1, 300 kilometers from Dar es Salaam to Morogoro, is complete. Continuing to Makutupora near Dodoma was commissioned in 2024. Further phases are under construction or procurement, with Turkish firm Yapı Merkezi as a key contractor. Tanzania's approach of building in manageable segments, maintaining competitive procurement, and keeping the project under a capable state-owned railway corporation has been praised as a model for the continent. Morocco stunned the world in 2018 by inaugurating Africa's first true high-speed railway, the LGV Tanger Kenitra, connecting Tangier to Kenitra at speeds up to 320 kilometers per hour. Built with French TGV technology, the 186-kilometer line demonstrated that high-speed rail is technically feasible in Africa. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, has its own ambitious master railway plan designed to eventually connect to Niger, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, and ultimately Senegal. The Lagos-Ibadan standard gauge railway opened in 2021, and the Abuja-Kaduna line has been operating since 2016. But political instability, security challenges, and financing difficulties have slowed further progress. Between 2015 and 2024, according to the Africa Finance Corporation, continent added approximately 2,000 kilometers of new railway. That is progress, but it is a fraction of what the AIHSRN envisions. Chapter 4. The funding crisis. The single greatest obstacle to building the African railway network is money. And the money problem is far more complex than simply not having enough. Africa's infrastructure financing gap is estimated at $68 to $108 billion annually. Rail projects, which require enormous upfront capital for returns that take decades to materialize, struggle to attract investment in a continent where most financing comes from government budgets that are already stretched thin. Roughly 80% of rail financing in Africa comes from governments, with institutional investors contributing just 1.4% and the private sector about 12%. As one AUDA-NEPAD official noted, African pension funds and sovereign wealth funds invest only 1.4% of their assets under management. If they increase that to 5%, it would generate $25 billion of infrastructure investment. China's Belt and Road Initiative provided much of the financing for the first wave of African railways in the 2000s. Between 2000 and 2020, African governments borrowed over $170 billion from China, much of it for infrastructure. But the Chinese lending boom has cooled significantly after several high-profile projects ran into financial trouble, including Kenya's SGR. Chinese banks have become far more cautious about extending further credit for African rail projects. This has created what some observers call the African railway paradox. The continent desperately needs rail connectivity to grow its economy, but it cannot afford to build the railways until its economy grows. Breaking this cycle requires creative financing, political commitment, and patience measured in decades, not election cycles. At a December 2023 technical workshop in Addis Ababa, participants discussed the challenges openly. The consensus was clear. Financing is the most critical obstacle, but it is not the only one. Also lacks sufficient railway engineering expertise, with very few African universities offering specialized rail engineering programs. There is also a need for harmonized cross-border regulations, customs procedures, and safety standards, none of which currently exist at a continental scale. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Colonialism. There is an uncomfortable dimension to Africa's railway story that cannot be ignored. The continent's new railways are being built largely by foreign contractors, financed by foreign loans, using foreign technology. The pattern has drawn uncomfortable comparisons to the colonial railways of the 19th century. In Kenya, the Chinese-built SGR follows almost exactly the same route as the British colonial railway it replaced. Both were built by foreign labor, financed by foreign capital, and designed primarily to move goods from the interior to a coastal port. The difference, supporters argue, is that independent African nations chose to build these railways for their own development goals, not at the barrel of a gun. Critics counter that the debt dynamics create their own form of dependency. In 2018, fears surfaced that China might seize Kenya's Mombasa port as collateral for unpaid SGR loans. While those specific fears were later disputed, they reflected a genuine anxiety about sovereignty and control. Kenya does not fully control the SGR it is paying for. Chinese operators manage significant aspects of the railway. The debate highlights a deeper question. Can Africa build and own its railway future, or will it always depend on external powers? Tanzania's approach, using a competitive mix of Turkish, Portuguese, and Chinese contractors while maintaining control through a strong state-owned railway corporation, is held up as one possible answer. But even Tanzania depends on foreign engineering expertise for its most complex projects. The AIHSRN envisions a future where Africa controls its own integrated network. But getting there requires building not just tracks, but institutions, skills, and manufacturing capacity that currently do not exist at the required scale. Chapter 6. Why it matters. The economic case for the African railway network is overwhelming. Transportation costs in Africa are among the highest in the world, adding 30 to 40% to the cost of goods traded between African countries. This makes African products uncompetitive on global markets and strangles intra-African trade, which accounts for just 15 to 18% of total African trade, compared to over 60% in Europe and nearly 50% in Asia. The AFCFTA, which aims to create a single market of 1.4 billion people, with a combined GDP approaching $3.4 trillion. She cannot function without physical connectivity. You cannot have free trade without the ability to move goods affordably. Railways are the most efficient and cheapest method of transporting heavy freight over long distances, far cheaper per ton kilometer than trucks, which currently carry the overwhelming majority of African cargo and destroy road surfaces in the process. The potential economic transformation is enormous. Railways generate economic activity not just through transportation, but through the industrial zones, logistics hubs, and urban centers that develop along their corridors. The AIHSRN envisions each corridor as more than just a railway. Along each route, there would be highways, fiber optic lines, power lines, industrial parks, and new cities. The infrastructure becomes a spine around which entire regional economies can develop. For the 16 landlocked African nations, railways are not an economic luxury. They are an economic lifeline. Connecting these nations to seaports by rail would fundamentally alter their economic trajectory. And there is a deeper, more symbolic dimension. Africa was carved into its current shape by European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884. Where borders were drawn on maps with no regard for geography, ethnicity, or existing trade routes. The colonial railways reinforced this fragmentation, connecting each territory to its colonial master rather than to its neighbors. An integrated continental railway would, for the first time, physically reconnect a continent that has been deliberately fragmented for over a century. Chapter 7. The long track ahead. As of 2025, the African Integrated High-Speed Railway Network remains far more vision than reality. Only 12.3% of the planned network has been studied in detail, largely due to funding constraints. The first implementation phase, originally planned for 2015 to 2025, has delivered master plans and feasibility studies, but very little new tracks specifically built under the AIHSRN banner. But the national projects are advancing. Tanzania continues its steady phased construction toward Burundi and the DRC. Nigeria is pushing ahead with its own master plan. Ethiopia is expanding outward from Addis Ababa. Morocco is planning to extend its high-speed network. Egypt is investing in its railway infrastructure. Ghana, Botswana, Namibia, Angola, and Zambia all have rail modernization projects at various stages. The pattern emerging is not the one the African Union originally envisioned. A top-down continental network built to a single master plan. Instead, what is happening is bottom-up. Individual nations building their own segments, slowly extending toward their borders, with the hope that these segments will eventually meet and connect. It is messier, slower, and less coordinated than the grand vision. But it may be more realistic. The true test will come at the borders. A railway that ends at a national boundary is just a national railway. If the AIHSRN only becomes real when trains can cross from one country to the next, without stopping, without changing gauge, without unloading cargo. That requires not just compatible track, but compatible signaling, compatible regulations, compatible customs procedures, and compatible political will. These are the hardest kilometers to build, not because of the engineering, but because of the politics. History offers both warnings and encouragement. Thus, it took the United States decades to build its transcontinental railroad, and it was built on the backs of exploited labor and broken treaties. Europe's high-speed rail network took half a century to reach its current form. China built the world's largest high-speed rail network in roughly 15 years. But with the resources of the world's second-largest economy and a centralized political system that Africa does not have, Africa will build this railway its own way, at its own pace, with its own compromises and its own innovations. It will take longer than 2063. It will cost more than $100 billion. Some corridors will succeed spectacularly. Others will stall or fail, or be overtaken by technology that does not yet exist. But the direction is set. After a century of fragmentation, Africa is building the infrastructure to reconnect itself. track by track, corridor by corridor, border crossing by border crossing. It will not happen quickly, but it has already begun.